Earlier this year in March, we came across an article about the AFL apologizing to Adam Goodes for the racism he received throughout his career. And I thought, didn't that happen like 7 years ago? Intrigued, we delved deep into Adam Goodes' story to find out more.
On this episode of Frontiers on Film, we'll cover a documentary called The Final Quarter, as well as another film called Get Out, focusing specifically on the cultural frontiers that are represented within them. A cultural frontier is a barrier or boundary dividing two cultures which collide in conflicting ideology, attitudes, and or ways of thinking. Cultural frontiers in literature examine core concerns with this clash, the erasure of culture and tradition, the ignition of conflict between large groups, and the prejudice that forms in the minds of hate. For hundreds of years, African Americans have been oppressed and taken advantage of purely based on the color of their skin. This aligns with the perspectives we see towards Indigenous Australians, as they are equally seen as lesser by the wider white community, with a complete disregard for their culture, tradition, and individuality. When two cultural frontiers clash, complex issues arise, which can be seen in the films The Final Quarter and Get Out.
The Final Quarter predominantly tells the story of the final years of Adam Goodes' AFL career, focusing on the racism he received. The film reveals the struggles and barriers that Adam Goodes faced in the colliding of cultural frontiers, as a systematic racial oppression baked into society clashes with the individuality of an Indigenous man just trying to fight against it. There are dominant racist perspectives that pervade Australian society's perspectives of Aboriginal people being lesser, primitive, dangerous, lacking good judgment, and drug addicts. Final Quarter depicts the Aboriginal perspective, challenging these assumptions by tracing Adam Goodes' philanthropic endeavours, spreading of positive ideals, and advocacy for his own people through large forms of TV and radio interviews, humanizing Adam Goodes by providing insight into his experiences of racism. Following the controversy between Adam and the 13-year-old girl who called him an ape, Australian television presenter and Collingwood Club president Eddie Maguire made an on-air gaffe, ironically linking Adam Goodes to the King Kong movie mid-interview. Whilst on a radio call, a man asked Maguire about the new King Kong movie. He then stated,
"Get Adam Goodes down for it, do you reckon?"
This dialogue underlines the clash between Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians, reinforcing assumptions that non-Indigenous Australians seek to perpetuate traditionalist and colonialist ideologies of elitism, serving to suppress Indigenous autonomy. While contrarily, for some non-Indigenous people's perspective, affirms the assumptions that Indigenous Australians make themselves victims and want attention. This is shown through the diegetic sound from a radio conversation.
I mean, this is typical Adam Goodes. He's always the victim. The bloke's a rich Australian athlete.
Without any non-diegetic sound in order to enhance the gravity of the topic.
Furthermore, succeeding the continual sledging and booing Adam received whenever he touched the ball, Goodes stood up to the racism of the crowds, with the use of non-diegetic sound, heightening tension, to reinforce the significance of his actions in shattering cultural barriers, seeking to express his familial identity proudly through a traditional war cry. However, Adam received heavy backlash and media outrage in response.
That will light up over the weekend like nothing else.
Probably best not to do it, though. Still, none of my business.
The general consensus interpreted it to be a menacing attack, as it looks as though he's throwing a spear at the Collingwood fans, which were booing him throughout the entire game. This conveys the concept of Aboriginal traditions being threatening to European ideology and colonialism. The issue of racism against Aboriginal Australians and presumptions of traditional culture being threatening emerge alongside the clashing of these cultural frontiers. These issues are demonstrated through the Final Quarter, through the incorporation of news articles being quoted and displayed throughout the scene, as well as series of vox pops highlighting the senses that people disapprove of his war cry. Get Out is a horror thriller movie directed by comedian Jordan Peele. His debut into the horror scene, Peele uses his own experiences as an African American and transforms them into this film. Get Out acts as a vessel for the cultural frontiers between African Americans and white people, highlighting and affirming the common assumption that white people are racist and believe they are superior to African Americans. Peele hints at a satirical premise when exploring the key idea of race as a cultural frontier, as he conveys that white people believe that African Americans are a waste of a body and that they can be exploited for their benefit.
The scene of Chris interacting with a prejudiced police officer explores the intersection of the cultural frontier between black people and white people. The scene begins with Chris and his girlfriend hitting a passing deer in their car. The deer symbolizes Chris's cultural identity and how it is stripped from him, similarly to how the deer is killed, representing the clash between cultures. The African American view shines in the way that Chris willingly gives up his ID without hesitation, as if it's something that happens to him on a regular basis, despite there being no reason to check it. The concept of racial profiling and the imbalance of power is a common characteristic of racism, which is evident in this scene. We're also shown the white perspective through the actions of the police officer. When he argues with Chris's girlfriend, he makes the assumption that both Chris and his girlfriend are trying to victimize Chris using the color of his skin and racism to defend himself and get out of the situation.
Throughout the film, Peele subtly but consciously scatters scenes that shape meaning, hinting at larger concepts being explored, providing insight into racist assumptions white people have about African Americans, such as that they are meek and deserve to be made slaves and are inferior, making the imbalance of power transparent. Peele shines light on these themes in scene 7, known as the escape scene. In this scene, we open to Chris waking up confined to a chair. Through Peele's implementation of an eye-level shot, it challenges the expectations that black people are inferior or weaker than white people, as it is followed by a white man, who is presumed to subsequently steal Chris's brain on a TV, with an additional eye-level shot. Peele uses irony with these camera angles, juxtaposing the presumption that the white man should appear more powerful than Chris. Furthermore, in a bid to block his ears from the hypnotizing sound waves of the teacup, Chris tears material from the chair which is revealed to be cotton. Peele uses the irony of picking cotton to be free, inverting the symbolism of cotton, while alluding to the cotton industry of the South profiting off the backs of slaves in the 1700s. Adding on to the deer scene from the previous clip, we are shown the deer again hanging on the wall from a first-person perspective, through the use of the deer as a motif, symbolizing his identity, which will be stripped for the benefit of white people, and used as a trophy to infer superiority. This portrays the cultural frontiers of black and white people, as white people assume that they are superior and can exploit black people for their own benefit, similarly to taking the deer's life as a decoration for the house.
These scenes from both The Final Quarter and Get Out present the issues of cultural frontiers and how different cultures' ideals, values, and attitudes clash through the exploration of racism as a cultural barrier.
That concludes this episode of Frontiers on Film. Thanks for watching everyone, and have a nice day.